The little girl's finger rose before anyone noticed her standing. It was a small finger, pale as porcelain, trembling slightly in the cold morning air, yet when it pointed, the entire courtyard seemed to tilt toward it. Her voice, clear, innocent, and far too loud for a child who had been taught manners since birth, cut through the murmurs of the crowd. He was in Mom's tummy too. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the billionaire froze. Alexander Vale had faced hostile takeovers, courtroom ambushes, and markets collapsing overnight. He had learned how to keep his face calm while empires burned. But now, in front of his glass and marble mansion, with journalists gathered for a charity photo op and chauffeurs waiting with open doors, his breath stopped as if the air itself had betrayed him. The boy she was pointing at stood near the iron gates, barefoot, his clothes hanging on him like borrowed rags. He clutched a torn backpack to his chest, eyes lowered, as though he'd already learned that looking up only invited trouble. His hair was dark, untrimmed, and his skin carried the quiet dust of streets that never quite let you forget them. "Sweetheart," Alexander said slowly, forcing a smile that cracked at the edges, "what are you talking about?" His daughter, Eleanor, didn't lower her hand. At 7 years old, she had a habit of speaking as if truth were a simple thing, something you said and then waited for the world to agree with you. She looked up at her father with confusion, not fear. "I remember," she said. "Mom told me once. She said there was another baby, but he didn't come home with us." The courtyard went silent in a way that felt heavy, deliberate. Somewhere, a camera shutter clicked and then stopped, as if even the machines sensed they'd crossed into forbidden ground. Alexander felt his chest tighten. Memories, carefully sealed, buried under years of strategy meetings and champagne galas, began to stir like something waking under ice. The boy shifted his weight. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't even looked up. Yet the words had landed on him like a brand. One of the security men stepped forward instinctively, but Alexander lifted a hand, stopping him without looking. His gaze was fixed on the child at the gate. "How do you know her name?" Alexander asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of the polished authority the world knew him for. The boy hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, he answered, "I don't." His voice was hoarse, unused. He swallowed. "But I know yours." A murmur rippled through the gathered staff and guests. Alexander's mind raced, cataloging possibilities, rejecting them one by one. There were charities he supported, hospitals he funded, shelters he'd visited for carefully timed photographs. But this wasn't on any schedule. Eleanor tugged at his hand. "Dad," she whispered, suddenly uncertain, "why are you scared?" The question hurt more than the accusation. Alexander knelt so he was level with her, cupping her small face. "I'm not scared," he lied gently. "I just need to understand." Behind Eleanor, the mansion loomed, cold, perfect, guarded by walls that kept chaos out and secrets in. Beyond the gate, the city stretched wide and uneven, swallowing boys like this one every day without ever noticing. The boy finally lifted his eyes. They were gray. Not soft, not pleading. Old eyes. Eyes that had learned to watch people leave. For a fraction of a second, Alexander saw something impossible reflected there. A face from 20 years ago, pale under hospital lights, hair damp with sweat, whispering, "Promise me." The ground seemed to tilt. "Where did you come from?" Alexander asked, standing slowly now, every muscle tight. The boy shrugged. "Where people go when they're not wanted." A sharp breath escaped Alexander before he could stop it. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment right now to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this take unexpected turns, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The guests began to whisper more openly now. A woman in pearls glanced at her husband, eyes bright with scandal. Someone muttered the word illegitimate, like a curse. The charity banners fluttered awkwardly in the breeze, suddenly meaningless. Alexander straightened his jacket, instinctively reclaiming the posture of control. "Who sent you here?" he asked. "No one," the boy said. "I followed the picture." "What picture?" "The one on the bus stop," he replied. "You were smiling, like you always do." Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. That smile, crafted by consultants, rehearsed in mirrors, had reached farther than he ever intended. Eleanor stepped forward before anyone could stop her. She crossed the polished stone and stood in front of the boy, studying him closely, as if comparing him to a memory only she could see. "You have Mom's eyes," she said softly. Alexander's heart slammed against his ribs. "That's enough," he said, more sharply than he meant to. He placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder, pulling her back. The boy flinched, not from the movement, but from the tone. For a moment, Alexander saw himself from the outside, a powerful man silencing a child, afraid of a truth he could no longer outrun. "Sir," one of the aides whispered urgently, "the press." Alexander ignored him. He took a step toward the gate. The iron bars felt suddenly thin, symbolic at best. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy hesitated, then answered. "Lucas." The name struck him like a blow. It was the name she had chosen. The name he had said was impractical. The name he thought had been buried with her. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the world felt altered, as if a hidden seam had split. "Lucas," he repeated, tasting the word. "Why did you come here?" The boy's fingers tightened around the torn backpack. His voice dropped to almost nothing. "Because I think," he said, "you're the only one who can tell me why my mother never came back." The sentence hung between them, sharp and unfinished, as the gates behind Lucas began to creak open on their own. The creak of the iron gate echoed louder than it should have. Alexander hadn't ordered it opened, yet one of the guards, pale and uncertain, had already obeyed an instinct older than protocol. The boy stepped inside, not boldly, not timidly, simply as someone crossing a line he'd imagined many times before. Up close, Lucas looked thinner than he had from a distance. There were faint scars along his knuckles, the kind that came from losing fights you never asked for. He smelled faintly of soap, cheap and sharp, as if he'd washed carefully for this moment. Alexander's mind raced ahead of his body. 20 years collapsed into seconds. A hospital corridor. A doctor's eyes refusing to meet his. A woman's hand slipping from his grip as machines hummed and then fell silent. Paperwork. Decisions. Silence that felt merciful at the time. "Dad," Eleanor whispered again. He realized his hand was trembling. "Take Eleanor inside," he said quietly to the nearest aide. "No," Eleanor said immediately, gripping his coat. "I want to stay." Alexander looked down at her, at the stubborn tilt of her chin, the same tilt her mother had when she refused to back down. Pushing her away now would only sharpen her curiosity into something unmanageable. "Stay," he said finally, though the word felt like surrender. The guests were no longer pretending this was a charity event. Phones hovered at chest level. Whispers sharpened into sentences. Alexander turned, his voice cutting through them with the authority that had built his empire. "This event is over," he said. "Please leave." Some hesitated, but money had taught them obedience. One by one, they retreated, disappointed, already composing rumors in their heads. The courtyard emptied until only staff, guards, and the three of them remained. Lucas stood with his shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing for a blow that hadn't come yet. Alexander exhaled slowly. "You said your mother never came back." Lucas nodded. "She left me with a woman who said she was a friend. She promised it was only for a little while." His jaw tightened. "She never returned. The woman sold the apartment. I was 6. Eleanor's breath caught. She took a half-step closer to Lucas, then stopped, unsure if she was allowed. "And your mother's name?" Alexander asked. Lucas hesitated longer this time. "Mara." The world narrowed to a pinpoint. Mara. Not the full name. The shortened one only he used. Only she allowed. Alexander turned away briefly, pressing his fingers to the bridge of his nose. The marble beneath his shoes felt cold, anchoring him to the present. He had rehearsed grief in private, but he had never rehearsed this. "She died," Alexander said, the word stiff, formal, a shield he'd perfected. "Years ago." "I know," Lucas said quietly. "That's what they told me. But no one told me why. Or who you were." Alexander looked back at him sharply. "Who told you about me?" "No one," Lucas said. "I found the papers." "What papers?" "In a box that didn't get thrown away," he replied. "Hospital forms. A name signed at the bottom. Yours." Alexander felt a chill crawl up his spine. Those papers should have been sealed. Disappeared. He had paid for that certainty. Eleanor frowned. "Dad," she said slowly, "if his mom is our mom, does that mean—" Alexander cut her off gently but firmly. "Not now." Lucas watched them, absorbing every word, every glance. "You didn't want me," he said, not accusing, just stating a conclusion he'd reached long ago. "Did you?" The question landed heavier than any courtroom accusation ever had. Alexander opened his mouth, then closed it. Truth pressed against his ribs, sharp and uncooperative. He had been younger then. Afraid. Advised. The doctors had said complications. Risks. One baby had survived. One hadn't, or so he'd been told. "I thought you were gone," he said finally. Lucas's eyes flickered. "But I wasn't." Silence stretched again, uncomfortable and raw. Eleanor broke it by doing the unexpected. She stepped forward and held out her hand to Lucas. "My name is Eleanor," she said. "You can call me Ellie." Lucas stared at her hand as if it were something fragile. After a moment, he reached out, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief, tentative, but it sent a visible jolt through Alexander. "You don't look poor," Eleanor added thoughtfully. "Just lost." Alexander almost laughed, and almost broke. "Come inside," he said suddenly. Lucas stiffened. "Why?" "Because," Alexander replied, choosing his words carefully, "this conversation doesn't belong in a courtyard." "And then what?" Lucas asked. Alexander met his gaze. "Then we figure out what should have happened a long time ago." Lucas considered this, weighing hope against habit. At last, he nodded once. Inside, the mansion felt too quiet. The staff watched from a distance, trained neutrality barely masking curiosity. Alexander led them into a smaller sitting room, one rarely used, filled with afternoon light and dust motes. "Sit," he said. Lucas perched on the edge of a chair. Eleanor sat beside him without hesitation. Alexander remained standing. "There are things I need to verify," he said. "Documents. Tests." Lucas's shoulders tightened again. "You think I'm lying?" "I think," Alexander replied, "that truth deserves proof, especially when it changes lives." Lucas looked down. "I don't want your money." "That's good," Alexander said quietly, "because this isn't about money." A pause. "Why didn't you look for me?" Lucas asked. Alexander's throat tightened. He turned toward the window, watching sunlight spill across the garden. "Because I believed the story I was given," he said, "and because believing it was easier than questioning it." Eleanor frowned. "Dad," she said, "Mom wouldn't lie." "No," Alexander said. "She wouldn't." The words tasted bitter. A knock interrupted them. One of the security men stepped in, tense. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice, "there's someone at the gate asking for the boy." Alexander's eyes sharpened. "Who?" The guard hesitated. "A woman. She says she's his aunt." Lucas went pale. His hands curled into fists. "That's her," he whispered. "The one who said she was helping." Alexander straightened, every instinct screaming caution. "Bring her to the East Room," he said. "And don't let her leave." Lucas looked up, fear and something like relief warring in his eyes. Alexander met his gaze. "Whatever the truth is," he said, "we're about to hear it." And as Alexander turned toward the door, he had no idea whether he was walking toward redemption, or a reckoning he'd spent 2 decades outrunning. The East Room had always unsettled Alexander. It was elegant in a way that felt deliberate, almost staged. High ceilings, tall windows, pale walls that reflected light without warmth. He stood near the fireplace now, arms crossed, while Lucas sat stiffly beside Eleanor on a velvet bench. Neither child spoke. The ticking of a distant clock seemed amplified, each second pressing down on Alexander's nerves. When the door finally opened, the woman who entered did not look like a villain. She was middle-aged, carefully dressed, her hair pinned back with neat precision. There were lines around her mouth that suggested constant worry rather than cruelty. She paused when she saw Lucas, her eyes widening just enough to betray surprise. "Lucas," she said softly. "I was worried." Lucas stood abruptly. "You said not to come here." "I didn't think you would," she replied, glancing at Alexander, recognition flickering across her face. Her posture stiffened. "Mr. Vale." Alexander felt a surge of anger so sudden it startled him. "You know who I am," he said. She nodded. "Of course I do. Then you know why you're here." Her lips pressed together. "I assume you think I've done something wrong." Lucas let out a sharp laugh. "You sold the apartment." Her eyes dropped. "I had to." "You took everything," he said. "You said Mom left it for me." "She did," the woman replied quietly. "But caring for a child costs money." Alexander stepped forward. "And abandoning him costs nothing?" She looked up at him then, eyes flashing. "I didn't abandon him. I placed him where he would survive." "On the streets?" Eleanor whispered, horrified. The woman's gaze flicked to the girl, then softened. "Not at first." Alexander raised a hand, silencing them all. "Your name," he said. "Clara," she replied. "Clara Renshaw. I was Mara's cousin." The name hit him with a dull ache. He remembered her now, hovering at the edge of hospital rooms, offering to help, insisting on handling arrangements while he drowned in his own grief. "You told me there were no other children," Alexander said. "I told you what the doctors told me," Clara replied. "One baby survived. One didn't." Lucas's breath caught. Alexander's voice hardened. "Then explain how the dead one is sitting in my house." Clara hesitated. The silence stretched. "The second baby was weak," she said finally. "Premature. The doctors weren't sure he'd last the night. Mara was unconscious. You were signing forms." Alexander's chest tightened. He remembered that pen slipping in his hand. "They moved him to another ward," Clara continued. "A smaller one. Fewer resources. They said it was temporary." "And?" Alexander demanded. "And then," she said, voice breaking slightly, "things went wrong. Equipment failed. A nurse panicked. By the time anyone realized, he was alive, but barely. They didn't want a lawsuit. They told me he'd died." Lucas stared at her, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "You let them," Alexander said. "I didn't know until later," Clara shot back. By then Mara was gone. And you— She stopped herself, but the words lingered anyway. I was gone, Alexander finished quietly. Clara's shoulders sagged. I took him. I thought it was what Mara would want. To keep him safe. To keep him away from the chaos that would follow. And you failed, Lucas said, his voice shaking now. Clara looked at him, guilt flooding her expression. I tried. But life isn't kind to people without money. Alexander felt something inside him fracture. Rage, regret, responsibility, all colliding at once. You had my number, he said. You had my lawyers. My foundation. You could have come to me. Clara met his gaze steadily. Would you have listened? The question cut deeper than any accusation. Eleanor slid off the bench and walked over to Alexander, slipping her small hand into his. Dad, she said softly, you would have listened. He squeezed her hand, grateful and ashamed all at once. Lucas looked between them, something raw and unguarded in his eyes. So what happens now? He asked. Do I disappear again? No, Alexander said immediately. Clara inhaled sharply. You can't just— I can, Alexander interrupted. And I will. He turned to Lucas. But this won't be simple. There will be tests. Legal battles. People who won't like this. I don't care, Lucas said. I just want the truth. Alexander nodded. Then that's what you'll get. A staff member appeared at the doorway, hesitant. Sir, she said, the media has regrouped outside. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. The world was already circling. Let them wait, he said. He looked back at Lucas. You're not leaving this house tonight. Lucas stiffened. I don't want charity. This isn't charity, Alexander replied. It's responsibility. Eleanor smiled at Lucas, tentative but hopeful. Clara sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. Mara loved you both, she whispered. She used to talk to her belly at night. She said she felt 2 heartbeats. Alexander felt his knees weaken. He turned away, gripping the mantel. 2 heartbeats. When he faced them again, his expression was set with something new, not certainty, but resolve. We'll do a DNA test tomorrow, he said. Until then, Lucas stays. And me? Clara asked quietly. Alexander regarded her coldly. You stay too. We're not finished. Lucas exhaled, a breath he seemed to have been holding his entire life. As the room settled into uneasy stillness, Alexander became acutely aware of how fragile this moment was. One test, one revelation, one truth away from either repair or ruin. And outside, beyond the walls, the world waited hungrily for whatever would come next. Night settled over the mansion with an unfamiliar heaviness. The lights along the corridors glowed softly, illuminating portraits of ancestors who had never faced a moment like this. Alexander walked ahead in silence as a housekeeper showed Lucas to a guest room usually reserved for visiting diplomats. The bed looked too large, too clean, as if it belonged to someone else's life. You can sleep here, the housekeeper said gently. If you need anything, press the button. Lucas nodded, his fingers brushing the fabric of the duvet as if testing whether it was real. When the door closed behind her, he stood alone for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of a world that had never known him. A knock came almost immediately. Eleanor slipped inside, closing the door carefully behind her. She held something in her hands, a small framed photograph. This was Mom, she said, holding it out. Lucas stared at the image. Mara smiled from another time, her eyes warm, her hand resting protectively over a rounded belly. His throat tightened. She looks happy, he said. She was, Eleanor replied. Dad says she laughed a lot before she got sick. Lucas swallowed. Did she ever talk about me? Eleanor nodded. Sometimes. She said I had a brother who liked stars. His breath caught. I used to sleep on rooftops, he whispered, so I could see them better. Eleanor smiled, a soft, sad smile. Then she was right. They stood there, two halves of a truth neither fully understood yet, bound by something deeper than explanation. Downstairs, Alexander sat alone in his study, the DNA consent forms spread out on his desk. He hadn't signed them yet. His pen hovered uselessly above the page. Every stroke felt like an admission of failure. A soft knock broke the silence. "Come in," he said. Clara stepped inside, her composure gone, eyes rimmed red. "You hate me," she said flatly. Alexander didn't look up. "That would be easier." She moved closer, standing across from his desk. "I didn't do this out of greed." "No," Alexander said. "You did it out of fear." She flinched. "You vanished. Lawyers handled everything. Foundations. Press releases. I thought if I came to you, you'd bury the truth the way you buried your grief." The words stung because they were close to the truth. "I buried everything," Alexander said quietly, "and I called it strength." Clara's voice trembled. "Lucas asked about you every year. I told him you were gone. And now—" "And now," she said, tears slipping free, "he's standing in a world that doesn't know what to do with him." Alexander finally signed the forms, the pen scratching loudly in the stillness. "Neither am I." Later that night, Alexander stood outside Lucas's door, his hand hovering before knocking. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals with less hesitation than this. Inside, Lucas sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling. "You can come in," he said. Alexander opened the door slowly. "I didn't know you were awake." "I didn't know how to sleep," Lucas replied. Alexander nodded. He understood that too well. "There are things I should have asked sooner," Alexander said, sitting in the chair across from him. "But I didn't know how." Lucas studied him carefully. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Me?" The question hit like a punch to the ribs. Alexander took a long breath. "I regret not knowing you," he said honestly. "I regret every year that passed without asking harder questions." Lucas looked down at his hands. "People always say that after." "I know," Alexander replied. "That doesn't make it enough." Silence settled again, but it wasn't empty. It was cautious, fragile. "They'll do the test tomorrow," Lucas said. "Yes. And if it says I'm not?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "Then I still owe you answers. And protection." Lucas's eyes flickered. "Why?" "Because," Alexander said, "you shouldn't have had to survive alone." Lucas nodded once, as if filing the words away for later judgment. Morning came too quickly. The sun streamed through tall windows as a private medical team arrived discreetly. Eleanor sat on a sofa, legs swinging, pretending not to be nervous. Clara stood near the window, hands clasped tightly. Alexander watched as the nurse prepared the swabs. Lucas rolled up his sleeve instinctively. "It won't hurt," Eleanor said. He gave a small smile. "I've had worse." The nurse swabbed his cheek, then Eleanor's. Alexander hesitated before leaning forward. As the swab touched his mouth, a strange thought crossed his mind, that this small cotton tip held the power to rearrange his entire legacy. When it was done, the samples were sealed and taken away with quiet efficiency. "Results by tomorrow evening," the doctor said. Tomorrow felt both too close and impossibly far. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Lucas wandered the gardens cautiously, Eleanor trailing behind him, pointing out her favorite hiding spots. From a distance, they looked natural together, too natural for Alexander's heart to bear comfortably. Inside, phones rang unanswered. Advisors left urgent messages. Stock prices wavered at the first whispers of scandal. Alexander ignored them all. That evening, as dusk settled, a car pulled up unexpectedly at the gates. A guard hurried inside, face tense. "Sir," he said, "there's a man asking for Lucas. Says he's his legal guardian." Lucas froze when he heard. "That's not true," he said quickly. "I don't know him." Alexander's eyes hardened. "What's his name?" "Daniel Mercer," the guard replied. "He has documents." Clara went pale. "No," she whispered. "He found him." Lucas's breathing quickened. "He runs the shelter," he said. "The one where I stayed. He said I owed him." Alexander straightened slowly. "No one owns you." "He won't let me go," Lucas said, fear creeping into his voice. "He never does." Alexander walked toward the door, his expression unreadable but his resolve unmistakable. "Let him in," he said. As the doors began to open once more, Alexander felt the fragile calm of the house fracture again, knowing that the truth wasn't the only thing threatening to surface. The man who entered did not bother to hide his confidence. Daniel Mercer walked as if the mansion already belonged to him, his suit a little too flashy, his smile sharpened by calculation rather than warmth. He glanced around the grand hall with open appraisal, as though estimating its worth piece by piece. "Mr. Vail," he said smoothly. "An honor." Alexander descended the steps slowly, every movement controlled. "You're trespassing." Mercer chuckled. "Hardly. I was invited." "No," Alexander replied coldly. "You were allowed." Lucas stood halfway up the stairs, Eleanor clutching his sleeve. The moment Mercer's eyes landed on him, the smile widened. "There you are," Mercer said. "I was wondering how long you'd hide." "I'm not hiding," Lucas said, forcing his voice steady. "I'm staying." Mercer raised an eyebrow. "With him?" Alexander stepped between them without thinking. "You'll address me when you speak." Mercer studied him more closely now, interest flickering beneath the arrogance. "You must be the father," he said. "Or at least the man who thinks he is." Eleanor gasped. "That's rude." Mercer laughed softly. "Kids say the funniest things when they don't understand contracts." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "What contract?" Mercer reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, tapping it lightly. "Guardianship. Temporary, of course. Signed years ago by his caretaker." Clara stiffened. "I never signed anything permanent." "You signed enough," Mercer replied. "Enough to give me authority." Lucas's fists clenched. "You made me work," he said. "You took my money." Mercer shrugged. "Shelter isn't free. Neither is food." Alexander's voice dropped dangerously low. "You exploited a minor." Mercer smiled thinly. "I gave him structure." Alexander stepped closer, close enough that Mercer's smile faltered just slightly. "You gave him fear." For a moment, the air between them felt charged, brittle. Then Mercer straightened, recovering his composure. "Regardless," he said, "the boy is legally under my supervision until proven otherwise. And last I checked, biology hasn't been established." Lucas's breath hitched. Alexander glanced back at him, then returned his gaze to Mercer. "The test is underway." "Until the results come back," Mercer said smoothly, "he comes with me." "No," Alexander said simply. Mercer laughed again, louder this time. "You don't get to decide that." Alexander turned to the guard. "Escort this man out." Mercer's eyes widened. "You can't." "I can," Alexander interrupted. "And I will." The guard stepped forward. Mercer's confidence cracked, irritation bleeding through. "You think money makes you untouchable," Mercer snapped. "But this won't disappear. I'll file injunctions. I'll call the press. People love stories like this." Alexander leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "So do prosecutors." Mercer froze. "You have documents," Alexander continued. "I have entire teams who specialize in dismantling them." Mercer swallowed, then forced a laugh. "You're bluffing." Alexander straightened. "Try me." The guards took Mercer by the arms. As he was dragged toward the door, he twisted his head toward Lucas. "You owe me," he hissed. "Don't forget that." Lucas didn't respond. He stood rigid, Eleanor's hand gripping his tighter now. When the doors slammed shut, the silence that followed felt explosive. Clara sank into a chair, trembling. "He's dangerous," she said. "He won't stop." "I know," Alexander replied. Lucas turned to him. "He's right about one thing," he said quietly. "The test isn't back yet." Alexander met his gaze. "Then until it is, you're under my protection." Lucas studied him for a long moment. "Even if it says I'm not yours?" Alexander didn't hesitate. "Yes." Something in Lucas's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. A wall cracking, just slightly. That night, sleep came even harder. Alexander sat alone in his study again, this time staring at an old photo frame he hadn't opened in years. He removed the backing slowly. Inside was a sonogram image, faded at the edges. Two small shapes, side by side. He traced them with his thumb, his chest tight. Across the hall, Lucas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying Mercer's voice in his head. He wondered what freedom actually felt like, whether it was something permanent or just another temporary shelter. Eleanor padded quietly into his room again, carrying a blanket. "Dad says storms sound louder in big houses," she whispered. "But they pass faster, too." Lucas smiled faintly. "Do you believe him?" She nodded. "Dad's learning not to lie." Somewhere in the mansion, a phone vibrated. Then another. Alexander's assistant burst into the study moments later, pale. "Sir," she said, "the media has the story. They're running with it already." Alexander closed his eyes briefly. "Let them." "There's more," she added hesitantly. "The lab called. They said there was an irregularity in the samples." Alexander looked up sharply. "What kind of irregularity?" "They won't say over the phone," she replied. "Only that the results may not be straightforward." Alexander felt a chill settle deep in his chest. Not straightforward meant delays. Questions. Doubt. And doubt was exactly what men like Mercer thrived on. He stood slowly, every instinct warning him that the next answer might shatter whatever fragile balance he'd built tonight. "Get the lab director on a secure line," he said. As thunder rolled faintly in the distance, Alexander realized that biology wasn't the only thing being tested anymore, and the outcome might cost far more than his reputation. The storm arrived before dawn, rain hammering against the tall windows as if trying to break inside. Alexander stood by the glass, phone pressed to his ear, listening to the lab director's careful, measured voice. "The samples themselves are intact," the man said. "But there's an anomaly in the genetic markers." Alexander's grip tightened. "Explain." "The maternal DNA aligns strongly," the director continued. "Stronger than we typically see. But the paternal markers, they're complicated." "Complicated how?" Alexander demanded. There was a pause. "It suggests prior medical intervention. Possibly an experimental procedure." Alexander's mind raced back 20 years. Late-night consultations. Doctors speaking in lowered voices. forms he barely remembered signing while terrified of losing Mara. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying," the director replied carefully, "that standard paternity testing may not give you a simple yes or no. We'll need additional analysis." "How long?" "At least 48 hours." Alexander ended the call without another word. 48 hours was an eternity in a world already sharpening its knives. Down the hall, Lucas jolted awake from a restless sleep as thunder cracked overhead. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then he remembered the soft bed, the unfamiliar silence, the promise that everything might change, and the fear that it might not. He sat up, rubbing his face, and noticed the door was ajar. Voices drifted from the corridor. "Can't keep him hidden forever," Clara was saying, her tone strained. "I'm not hiding him," Alexander replied quietly. "I'm protecting him." "And what happens when the truth comes out?" she asked. "When they realize this isn't as simple as blood?" Lucas's chest tightened. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood silently, inching closer to the door. "The truth," Alexander said, "is that a child was lost because adults were afraid." "That's the story." Clara sighed. "That won't satisfy them." "It doesn't have to," Alexander replied. "It only has to be right." Lucas stepped back before they could notice him. His heart pounded. "Not simple. Not blood." The words echoed unpleasantly. Later that morning, the mansion buzzed with tension disguised as routine. Security doubled. Staff avoided eye contact. Eleanor sensed it all and reacted the only way she knew how, by clinging to Lucas's side like a shadow. "Do you think they'll make you leave?" she asked him while they sat in the breakfast room, untouched food between them. Lucas forced a smile. "I don't know." She frowned. "I'd tell them no." He laughed softly. "I don't think they'd listen to me either." Across the room, Alexander watched them, something aching in his chest. They leaned toward each other naturally, sharing quiet jokes, as if years hadn't been stolen from them. A phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Another buzz. Then another. Finally, he answered. "What is it?" "Sir," his assistant said, her voice tight, "Daniel Mercer has filed an emergency petition. He's claiming unlawful detention and emotional manipulation." Alexander closed his eyes. "Of course he has." "There's more," she continued. "He's also contacted a journalist. One with a reputation." Alexander felt a familiar cold settle over him. "Keep Lucas away from the windows." Lucas sensed something was wrong the moment Alexander entered the room. "What's happening?" Lucas asked. Alexander hesitated. He'd spent years mastering control, but now every decision felt like it could fracture something delicate. "Someone wants to take you," he said carefully. "And I'm not going to let that happen." Lucas's jaw tightened. "Because I might be your son?" "Because you are a child," Alexander replied. "And because you were hurt." "That's not an answer," Lucas said. Eleanor stepped forward. "You can stay," she said firmly. "You're my brother." Lucas looked at her, then back at Alexander. "Even if the test doesn't say it?" Alexander knelt in front of him, lowering himself deliberately. "Family isn't just what a lab says," he said. "But the world listens to labs more than it listens to children." Lucas swallowed. "Then what do I do?" Alexander placed a hand over his own chest. "You stay, and you let me handle the rest." Outside, cars began lining the street beyond the gates. Cameras. Microphones. The storm clouds broke apart, replaced by a harsh, invasive sunlight. The journalist arrived just before noon. She was sharp-eyed, calm, carrying herself with practiced neutrality. Alexander met her in the entry hall, refusing her access beyond it. "Mr. Vale," she said. People are very interested in your sudden change of domestic circumstances." "I'm sure they are," Alexander replied. "Is it true," she asked, "that you're sheltering a runaway boy with no confirmed relation to you?" Alexander's gaze hardened. "It's true that I'm sheltering a child." "And the rumors of a hidden twin?" she pressed. Alexander didn't answer. Her eyes flicked past him, catching a glimpse of Lucas peeking from the staircase. The slightest smile curved her lips. "Thank you for your time," she said. "This will be fascinating." When she left, Alexander knew the damage was already done. That afternoon, Clara found Lucas in the library, standing in front of a shelf he clearly didn't know how to use. "I never meant for this," she said softly. Lucas didn't turn. "You meant for me to survive." She nodded. "I did. But you didn't mean for me to matter," he said. Her breath caught. "That's not true." "Then why does it feel like everyone's deciding who I belong to?" Lucas said. "Except me." Clara had no answer. By evening, the house felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were listening. Eleanor fell asleep on the couch beside Lucas, her head on his shoulder. He didn't move, afraid to wake her, afraid that if he did, she might disappear like everything else good in his life. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching them. His phone rang again. This time, he answered. "Mr. Vale," the lab director said, his voice urgent. "We found something else." Alexander straightened. "What?" "The DNA suggests that Lucas may not be biologically yours in the conventional sense," the director said. "But there is a direct genetic link. One that indicates shared origin rather than direct inheritance." Alexander's heart pounded. "Shared origin?" "Yes," the director said. "Which would only be possible if—" The call cut off abruptly. Alexander stared at the phone, dread crawling up his spine. Across the room, Lucas stirred in his sleep, murmuring something Eleanor couldn't quite hear. And for the first time since this began, Alexander feared that the truth, when it finally arrived, might be more dangerous than the lie he'd lived with for 20 years. Alexander stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear long after the line went dead. Shared origin. The phrase echoed with a sterile finality that felt anything but clinical. His mind tore backward through memory. Consultations held behind closed doors, whispered reassurances about options, the way Mara had squeezed his hand and said, "Just make sure they're safe." He lowered the phone slowly. Across the room, Eleanor shifted in her sleep, curling closer to Lucas. The boy stirred but didn't wake, his brow furrowing as if even rest demanded vigilance. Alexander watched them, a tightness gripping his chest. 2 children. 2 lives shaped by choices neither of them had made. Shared origin. He turned away and walked back to his study, closing the door with deliberate quiet. He poured himself a glass of water, hands unsteady, and didn't drink it. Instead, he opened a locked drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay a slim folder, edges worn. Medical records. Confidential. He had sealed them away after Mara's funeral, telling himself that looking back wouldn't change anything. Now, with the house asleep and the world circling outside his gates, he opened it. The documents were dense, technical, heavy with language designed to obscure rather than explain. But certain words leapt out now, glowing with new meaning. Experimental embryonic stabilization. Genetic preservation. Contingency protocol. Alexander sank into his chair. A knock sounded softly at the door. "Dad." Eleanor's voice, small and uncertain. He closed the folder quickly. "Come in." She padded inside, rubbing one eye. "Lucas is shaking," she said. "I think he's dreaming." Alexander stood immediately. Together they walked back to the guest room. Lucas lay on his side, breathing fast, lips moving silently. Eleanor climbed onto the bed and placed a hand on his arm. "It's okay," she whispered. You're here." Lucas's breathing slowed. His eyes fluttered open. "Sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't do anything," Alexander said gently. Lucas stared at him for a long moment, then sat up. "You know something," he said. It wasn't a question. Alexander hesitated. He had promised himself honesty, but truth, real truth, felt like a blade without a handle. "I know that things are more complicated than I expected," he said carefully. Lucas's jaw tightened. "That's what everyone keeps saying." Eleanor looked between them. "Is he my brother?" Alexander opened his mouth, closed it. The silence stretched. "I don't know yet," he said. Lucas laughed softly, bitter. "Figures." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I don't care what the test says," she said. "He feels like my brother." Lucas looked at her, something raw breaking through his guarded expression. "You don't have to say that." "I do," she replied stubbornly. Alexander watched them, heart aching. He had built companies from nothing, orchestrated outcomes with ruthless precision. But here, control slipped through his fingers like sand. "I'm going to find out the truth," he said. "All of it." Lucas nodded slowly. "Just don't lie to me." Alexander held his gaze. "I won't." The next morning arrived with no mercy. News vans crowded the street beyond the gates. Headlines screamed speculation. Alexander's name trended across platforms he pretended not to follow. His legal team flooded his inbox with strategies, injunctions, counter-narratives. He ignored them all. Instead, he called the lab director directly. "I need everything," Alexander said. "Full disclosure. No summaries." There was a pause. "Mr. Vale," the director replied carefully, "some of these procedures were controversial." "Were they legal?" Alexander asked. "Yes," the man said. "Barely." Alexander closed his eyes. "Explain." "Years ago," the director said, "there were trials involving embryonic splitting, creating genetically identical embryos as a safeguard in high-risk pregnancies." Alexander's breath caught. "Identical." "Yes," the director confirmed. "In your case, one embryo was implanted. The other was preserved as a contingency." Alexander felt the room tilt. "Preserved." "There were complications," the director continued. "The second embryo was implanted later, without your explicit consent. Emergency authorization was used." Alexander's pulse roared in his ears. "So Lucas." "Lucas would share genetic origin with Eleanor," the director said. "But neither of them would be genetically your biological child in the traditional sense." Alexander's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then whose are they?" "The genetic material was selected," the director said, "from donors screened to minimize risk." Alexander ended the call and stared at the wall, his reflection faint in the glass. He felt hollowed out, betrayed, furious, and terrified. Everything he thought he knew had been a carefully curated illusion. He found Lucas in the garden later that afternoon, sitting on the edge of the fountain, skipping stones into the water. Eleanor watched from a nearby bench, legs swinging. "Did you find out?" Lucas asked without looking up. Alexander sat beside him. The stone in Lucas's hand hovered, then dropped. "Yes," Alexander said. "But it's complicated." Lucas scoffed quietly. "Always is." Alexander took a breath. "You and Eleanor share the same genetic origin." Lucas turned sharply. "So we're siblings." "Yes," Alexander said. Relief flashed across Lucas's face, brief, fragile. "Then you are my—" "No," Alexander said gently. "Not biologically." The relief shattered. Lucas stood abruptly. "So what am I to you?" Alexander looked up at him, eyes steady despite the storm inside. "You are a child I failed to protect. You are someone I intend to fight for." "That's not an answer," Lucas snapped. "It's the only honest one I have right now," Alexander replied. Lucas laughed, sharp and humorless. "Figures. I don't belong anywhere." Eleanor jumped up. "That's not true." Lucas rounded on her, immediately regretful. "I didn't mean." She hugged him suddenly, fiercely. "You belong with me." Lucas froze, then slowly wrapped his arms around her. Alexander watched, throat tight, as something inside him shifted irrevocably. Biology had always been his anchor. Now it felt like a mirage. A guard approached, hesitating. "Sir," he said, "Daniel Mercer is back. This time with a court order." Alexander stood, expression hardening. Lucas pulled away from Eleanor. "He's not taking me." Alexander placed a hand on his shoulder. "No," he said quietly. "He's not." But as Alexander turned toward the house, court papers already being carried toward him, he knew this fight had just crossed a line. Because the truth, now exposed, didn't simplify anything. It shattered the rules entirely. The court order felt heavier than paper should. Alexander took it from the guard slowly, scanning the seal, the language cold and absolute. Temporary custody transfer. Mandatory appearance. Immediate compliance. Lucas stood rigid a few steps behind him, eyes fixed on the document as if it were a weapon pointed directly at his chest. "No," Eleanor whispered. "That's not fair." Daniel Mercer stood just beyond the threshold now, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. His expression was polished, satisfied, the kind of patience that came from believing the system would eventually bend in his favor. "Mr. Vail," Mercer said smoothly, "I trust you'll do the right thing." Alexander folded the paper once, then again, deliberate. "The right thing," he said quietly, "is rarely the legal one." Mercer's smile tightened. "Careful." Alexander turned to Lucas. "Go upstairs," he said softly. Lucas shook his head. "I'm not running." "I know," Alexander replied. "That's why I'm asking." Eleanor grabbed Lucas's hand. "I'm not letting him take you." Mercer sighed theatrically. "This emotional manipulation is exactly why the court—" Alexander cut him off with a sharp glance. "You'll stop speaking about children as if they're leverage." The officer nearest Mercer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir," he said to Alexander, "we're required to—" "I understand your duty," Alexander replied evenly, "and I respect it. But I will not hand a child over to a man under active investigation." Mercer's eyes flashed. "Allegations." Alexander turned back to the officer. "Check your system," he said. "The report was filed this morning." The officer hesitated, then tapped into his tablet. His brow furrowed. Mercer's confidence wavered for the first time. "That won't hold," Mercer snapped. "You can't just—" The officer looked up. "Sir," he said to Mercer, "we need to verify this before proceeding." Mercer's jaw clenched. "Do your job." The delay was brief, but it was enough. "Lucas," Alexander said quietly, "look at me." Lucas did. His eyes were dark, guarded, but burning with something like hope he refused to name. "No matter what happens in the next hour," Alexander continued, "you don't go with anyone without my lawyers present. Do you understand?" Lucas nodded. Eleanor squeezed his hand harder. "You promised," she whispered. "I know," Alexander said. The officer cleared his throat. "Sir," he said to Mercer, "we're going to need you to step aside until this is resolved." Mercer stared at Alexander, fury simmering beneath his smile. "This isn't over," he said. "The court will decide where the boy belongs." Alexander met his gaze. "It already is deciding," he said. "Just not in your favor." Mercer turned sharply and walked away, his coat snapping behind him like a threat. When the doors closed again, the house exhaled. Lucas sank onto the nearest chair, legs weak. Eleanor climbed into his lap without asking, burying her face against his chest. Alexander stood there, unmoving, until the adrenaline drained and left only exhaustion behind. Clara appeared quietly from the hallway. "You just made this very public," she said. "It already was," Alexander replied. She hesitated. "The truth about the embryos, if that gets out." Alexander turned to her. "It will," he said. "And when it does, I won't hide it." Lucas looked up sharply. "You're going to tell them?" "I'm going to tell the truth," Alexander replied. "All of it?" "That could destroy you," Clara said. Alexander looked down at Eleanor and Lucas, still clinging to each other. "Some things are worth being destroyed for." The following hours blurred together. Lawyers arrived. Calls stacked. Strategies were proposed and discarded. Alexander listened, asked questions, but made no promises. Lucas sat in the study corner, watching it all like someone observing a foreign language being spoken around him. He felt invisible again, despite the attention orbiting him. Eleanor noticed. She tugged at Alexander's sleeve. "He doesn't like this," she whispered. Alexander crouched in front of Lucas. "You don't have to stay here," he said. "You can go to your room." Lucas shook his head. "If I leave, they'll decide everything without me." Alexander studied him. "Then stay," he said. "But know this, your voice matters." Lucas hesitated. "Even if I'm not really part of this family?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "You are part of this story," he said. "And stories don't belong to just one person." That evening, the lab director arrived in person. They met in the study, doors closed, the weight of confidentiality pressing in. "There's one more thing," the director said carefully. "Something I didn't include in the report." Alexander stiffened. "What?" "The embryonic material," the director said. "It wasn't randomly selected." Alexander felt his pulse spike. "Explain." "The donors were chosen for compatibility," the director continued, "but also for discretion." Alexander leaned forward. "Whose genetic material was used?" The director hesitated. "The maternal donor was Mara," he said. "The paternal." Alexander's breath caught. "You said neither child was biologically mine." "In the traditional sense," the director clarified. "But the paternal genetic material was derived from your own stem cells." The room went silent. "That's impossible," Alexander said. "It was experimental," the director replied. "Your cells were modified to reduce transmission risks. Genetically, the children are derived from you, but altered." Alexander felt dizzy. "So they are mine." "Yes," the director said softly. "Just not in a way most people understand." The director left soon after, his words echoing long after the door closed. Alexander sat alone, staring at nothing. Outside the study, Lucas paced, restless. Eleanor watched him, worry etched across her small face. Alexander finally emerged. Lucas looked at him immediately. "You know," he said. Alexander nodded. "I do." "Well?" Lucas demanded. "Am I yours or not?" Alexander crossed the distance between them slowly. "You are," he said. "In every way that matters." Lucas searched his face for deception, for hesitation. Finding none, his breath shuddered out of him. "So why does it still feel like I could lose all this?" he asked. Alexander placed a hand on his shoulder. "Because the world doesn't understand families like ours," he said. "And it's about to try very hard to tear us apart." Lucas nodded slowly. "Then we fight." Alexander's lips curved into something like a smile. "Yes," he said, "we do." But even as the words left his mouth, his phone vibrated again. Another message, another warning. A leaked document. A name attached. A deadline looming. And Alexander knew that claiming Lucas as his son would cost him far more than he had already risked. It would cost him everything he'd built. And he was no longer sure the world would let him choose. The leak hit before sunrise. Alexander learned about it not from his advisors, but from the low, insistent buzz of his phone vibrating across the nightstand. One glance at the screen told him everything he needed to know. Headlines. Screenshots. Medical jargon stripped of context and fed to the public like bait. Billionaire's secret experimental children. Vale dynasty built on science, not blood. Who is the boy in the mansion? Alexander sat up slowly, the room spinning just enough to remind him he was still human. Across the hall, Eleanor slept curled around a pillow. Down the corridor, Lucas lay awake, staring at a ceiling that suddenly felt far too fragile to protect him from the world outside. Within minutes, the house was alive. Phones rang. Footsteps echoed. Doors opened and closed with sharp urgency. Advisors arrived unannounced, faces pale, voices overlapping. Alexander moved among them like a ghost, absorbing fragments. Stock futures already reacting. Ethics committee demanding statements. Mercer's lawyer just went live. "Enough," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the chaos. The room stilled. "Clear the room," he continued. "I want 5 minutes." They hesitated, then obeyed. When the doors closed, Alexander exhaled and pressed his palms to the desk. For the first time since this began, the weight of it all pressed down without resistance. A soft knock. "Come in," he said. Lucas stepped inside. He hadn't slept. It showed in the tightness of his jaw, the way his shoulders were set as if bracing for impact. "I saw it," Lucas said. Alexander nodded. "I assumed you would." "They're calling me an experiment," Lucas continued. "Like I'm something that escaped a lab." Alexander swallowed. "I'm sorry." Lucas shook his head. "Don't be. Just tell me the truth. All of it. No filters." Alexander gestured to the chair across from him. Lucas sat, arms crossed. "You were never an experiment," Alexander said. "You were a contingency, a safeguard built out of fear." Lucas frowned. "Fear of what?" "Losing everything," Alexander replied. "Your mother, Eleanor. The future we thought was guaranteed." Lucas stared at him. "So I was a backup plan." "No," Alexander said firmly. "You were a second chance. One I didn't know existed." Lucas looked away. "That doesn't make it better." "I know," Alexander said quietly. "But it makes it honest." A silence settled between them, heavy but no longer hostile. "What happens now?" Lucas asked. Alexander leaned back, eyes tired but focused. "Now the world tries to decide whether you deserve to exist without explanation." Lucas let out a breath. "And you. And I make sure they fail." Before Lucas could respond, Eleanor burst into the room, her hair a mess, clutching a tablet. "They're talking about us," she said breathlessly. "At school. They sent messages." Alexander's chest tightened. He took the tablet gently from her hands and set it aside. "You're not going to school today," he said. "Ever again?" she asked, alarmed. "Yes," he said with a small smile. "Just not today." She looked between him and Lucas. "Are they going to take him away?" Alexander knelt in front of her. No. She studied his face carefully, searching for cracks. Finding none, she nodded once and wrapped her arms around his neck. Behind them, Lucas watched, something twisting painfully in his chest. Not jealousy, but fear of how easily things could still be taken from him. The press conference was unavoidable. By midday, the front lawn was a forest of microphones and satellite vans. Alexander stood inside the entry hall, jacket buttoned, expression unreadable, while his legal team ran through final notes. "You don't have to say everything," one of them urged. "We can deflect. Delay." "No," Alexander replied. "We end this today." The doors opened. Flashbulbs exploded like lightning. Alexander stepped forward alone. "I will answer questions after I make a statement," he said calmly, his voice carrying effortlessly. "Interruptions will end this immediately." The crowd quieted, reluctantly. "There has been speculation about a child currently under my protection," Alexander continued. "His name is Lucas." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Lucas is my son," Alexander said. The noise surged. "Biology is being debated publicly by people who do not understand the science involved," he went on. "What I will say is this. Lucas was born as the result of medical decisions made during a crisis. Decisions that should never have been hidden." Cameras whirred. Reporters leaned forward. "I failed," Alexander said plainly. "I failed to ask questions. I failed to protect a child who needed me. That failure ends now." A reporter shouted, "Is it true he was abandoned?" Alexander's eyes hardened. "He was lost. There is a difference." Another voice cut in. "What about the man claiming guardianship?" "Mr. Mercer is under investigation," Alexander replied. "And he will not be anywhere near my children again." Children. The word echoed louder than any flash. Inside the house, Lucas watched the broadcast from the staircase, Eleanor beside him. His hands shook. "He said my name," Lucas whispered. Eleanor grinned. "Told you." But even as pride flickered, fear followed close behind. Lucas knew enough now to understand that public declarations didn't end private wars. As if summoned by the thought, a lawyer hurried toward Alexander the moment the conference ended, speaking urgently into his ear. Alexander's expression tightened. Inside, Lucas felt it immediately. "What?" he asked when Alexander returned. Alexander hesitated, a fraction too long. "There's been a motion filed," he said. "Emergency injunction. They're challenging my custodial claim based on procedural consent." Lucas's stomach dropped. "So they can still take me." "Not today," Alexander said. "But this just became a court fight." Lucas nodded slowly. "I've been running my whole life." Alexander placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not running now." "But what if I lose?" Lucas asked quietly. Alexander met his gaze. "Then I lose too." That night, as the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Lucas stood alone at the window, watching the lights beyond the gate. Somewhere out there, people argued about his existence as if it were a concept, not a life. Behind him, Alexander stopped in the doorway. "I never asked you something important," Alexander said. Lucas didn't turn. "What?" "If you want this," Alexander said. "This family. This fight." Lucas was silent for a long moment. Then he turned, eyes steady, voice firm. "I didn't choose how I was born," he said. "But I'm choosing where I stand." Alexander nodded once. Outside, the gates remained closed, but the pressure against them was building. And tomorrow, the world would decide whether truth was enough, or whether power would demand another sacrifice. Morning arrived with an unnatural calm, the kind that felt rehearsed. The lawn was still littered with footprints from the night before, impressions pressed into the grass by cameras, cables, and people who believed proximity entitled them to answers. Inside, the mansion felt like a sealed chamber, every room holding its breath. Lucas sat at the long dining table, untouched breakfast growing cold in front of him. He wasn't hungry. Hunger had changed its meaning over the years, from physical need to something deeper, a craving for certainty that food could never touch. Across from him, Eleanor methodically peeled an orange, placing each slice in a neat circle. "Dad says courtrooms smell like old books," she said, as if discussing weather. Lucas glanced at her. "Have you been in one?" She shook her head. "But Mom watched legal dramas. She said the truth always comes out eventually." Lucas almost smiled. Almost. Alexander entered, already dressed in a dark suit, tie perfectly aligned. He looked composed in the way only people trained to survive pressure could be, but Lucas noticed the faint shadows beneath his eyes. "The car will be ready in 20 minutes, Alexander said. "We'll leave through the east gate." "Am I going?" Lucas asked. Alexander paused. "Not today." Lucas stiffened. "You said my voice matters." "It does," Alexander replied. "But today is about strategy, not exposure." Lucas pushed back his chair. "So I just sit here while people decide if I belong?" Alexander met his gaze evenly. "You stay safe." "That's not the same thing," Lucas said. Eleanor reached for his hand. "You belong with me," she said again, quieter now, as if reminding herself too. Alexander watched them, jaw tight. "I won't make promises I can't keep," he said. "But I won't let you disappear again." Lucas nodded slowly, not fully convinced but unwilling to fight her words. The courthouse loomed like a monument to decisions that never felt personal to the people making them. Alexander walked up its steps alone, cameras clicking furiously, his expression unreadable. Inside, lawyers surrounded him, voices low, urgent. "The injunction hinges on consent," one said. "They're arguing the embryonic procedure invalidates parental claim." "And Mercer?" Alexander asked. "Positioning himself as the stable alternative," another replied. "He's pushing the narrative that Lucas is being coerced by wealth." Alexander scoffed softly. "He exploited him. They'll say you're exploiting him now." In the gallery, the judge took her seat, eyes sharp, unimpressed by power or spectacle. The room settled into tense stillness. Back at the mansion, Lucas paced the length of the library, counting steps without realizing it. Clara sat nearby, hands folded, watching him with a mix of guilt and concern. "You don't have to stay here," Lucas said suddenly. Clara looked up. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere," he replied. "You've done enough." Her eyes filled. "I stayed because I thought you might need someone who remembered before all this." Lucas stopped pacing. "Do you remember my mom?" Clara nodded. "Every day." "What would she want?" he asked. Clara hesitated, then said softly, "She'd want you to choose yourself." Lucas absorbed that quietly. At the courthouse, Mercer's lawyer stood, voice smooth, rehearsed. "This child has been thrust into a media storm by a man with immense power. My client provided shelter when no one else did." Alexander rose slowly. "Shelter is not ownership," he said. The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Vale, you'll speak when addressed." Alexander inclined his head, the smallest acknowledgement. Mercer sat behind his counsel, confidence carefully reconstructed. He met Alexander's gaze and smiled thinly. Back home, Eleanor climbed onto the sofa beside Lucas and rested her head on his shoulder. "If they make you leave," she said quietly, "I'll come with you." Lucas's throat tightened. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do," she replied simply. "That's what family does." He stared ahead, blinking rapidly. The judge leaned forward. "This court recognizes the complexity of this case," she said. "But complexity does not excuse instability." Alexander's lawyer stood. "With respect, stability is not found in paperwork alone. It is found in protection, care, and intent." "And intent," the judge replied, "must be proven." She adjourned briefly, retreating to chambers. The wait stretched thin. At the mansion, a car pulled up unexpectedly. Lucas stiffened. "Who's that?" A guard entered quickly. "Sir," he said to Clara, "there's a woman at the gate. She says she's from the hospital." Clara went pale. "Which hospital?" "She won't say," the guard replied. "But she has documents. Old ones." Lucas felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Bring her in," Clara said before she could stop herself. Moments later, the woman entered, older, nervous, clutching a folder like a shield. "My name is Dr. Helen Cross," she said. "I was on staff the night Lucas was born." Lucas's heart pounded. "I've been watching the news," Dr. Cross continued, "and I can't stay silent any more." Clara stood slowly. "About what?" Dr. Cross looked at Lucas, eyes heavy with regret. "About the decision that changed your life." At the courthouse, the judge returned, face unreadable. "This court orders temporary custodial stay with Mr. Vail," she said, "pending full evidentiary review." Alexander exhaled, tension easing slightly, but only slightly. "This does not establish permanent guardianship," the judge added, "and it does not negate other claims." Mercer's smile faded, replaced by calculation. Outside, Alexander was immediately surrounded by reporters again. He raised a hand, stopping them. "This is not over," he said calmly. "But neither is my commitment." Back at the mansion, Dr. Cross opened the folder, hands trembling. Inside were faded charts, signatures, timestamps. "They told us to mark the second implantation as non-viable," she said. "We were afraid." "The funding. The pressure." Lucas stared at the papers, his life reduced to ink and margins. "Why tell us now?" he asked. Dr. Cross swallowed. "Because the truth is finally louder than my fear." A phone rang sharply. Clara answered, listened, then looked at Lucas with wide eyes. "It's Alexander," she said. The court ruled, temporarily in his favor. Lucas let out a shaky breath, relief crashing through him, but it didn't last. Dr. Cross closed the folder slowly. "This will change everything," she said, "if it becomes public." Lucas looked at the documents again, then toward the window, where the world waited. "I'm tired of being a secret," he said quietly. Outside, beyond the gates, engines idled and cameras remained trained on the house. And inside, with the truth finally unfolding, Lucas stood at the center of a storm that was far from finished.